This is going to be an exciting panel, as the others were. This panel's going to focus on the mission readiness, but it's also going to drill down on budget issues, personnel issues, acquisition issues. It's going to speak to these issues from the perspective of the intelligence community, various agencies, also from the Congress, from the private sector, and it's going to cover a lot of areas. Let me just, by way of introduction, and I think we heard a little of this morning from Ambassador John Negroponte and certainly Admiral McConnell and Admiral Denny Blair. Let me just say, as being one of the plank holders with the ODNI, and we're fortunate to have Leslie Allen here, I just wanted to mention two things. And this came up a little in the comments on John McLaughlin a few minutes ago about Syria and what the Syrians were doing in Al-Kabar, and about North Korea with their covert uranium enrichment program, and A.Q. Khan and his proliferation network, some of the successes of the IC. Well, there are other organizations, and many of them we don't hear about because it's not necessary. I worked closely, I was director of the National Counterproliferation Center, and we worked on those issues. And we brought 16 agencies together because those agencies were doing great work. Not that the center, we weren't doing the great work, they were doing the great work. But we integrated, we came together. And this was an initiative of John Negroponte, the first DNI. He wasn't told to create a center of this type. He created it. He said, weapons of mass destruction is a key issue for the president and for the security of this country. Let's do it. And we did it, and it was successful, powerful. Whether you're looking at what's going on in North Korea, whether you're looking at Iran, whether you're looking at arms control issues that touch Russia, whether you're looking at Syria and their chemical weapons program, and what they were doing with it, and where they had their chemicals stashed, and the success of the community in making sure those chemicals were removed from Syria. Also, and this is where Leslie and I were mission managers, Leslie for Iran, I for North Korea. This was something that John Negroponte, followed by the former DNIs, pursued, and you heard Denny Blair talk about this morning. Regional issues. So the students we have in the audience here, we have students from 8 different universities. And I encourage you to keep pursuing it because the regional issues are so critical. Getting the language, getting the history, getting the culture, understanding the perspective of where they go on, and understanding how those countries and their policies could possibly, and do in fact, in many cases, affect the national security of the United States. So pursue it. So pursuing issues. So there's a whole spectrum of successes, I believe, with integration that the DNI, starting with John Negroponte, and the continuing certainly with Jim Clapper, succeeded. So I think this panel will bring a lot of that together, but I wanted to make mention of those points because I think it's so relevant to when we look at 10 years of integration and where we are. And those are major areas. Today we're very fortunate to have this panel, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Roger Mason as the moderator. Dr. Roger Mason and I go way back. This is a PhD physicist sitting here who really knows weapons of mass destruction, although he's going to cover a lot of other issues with our distinguished panel. He is presently the Senior Vice President for National Security and Intelligence at Nobles. He was the first Assistant DNI for Systems and Resources Analysis. He was a Senior Director at the Institute for Defense Analysis, and I can go down the list. This is a very accomplished patriot. So Roger, I will pass it over to you, and you, Pat.
Okay, well, Joe, thank you very much for that incredible introduction. I very much appreciate it. And as Joe mentioned, he and I go back a long way and in years of service. So it's good to see you and everyone else here at INSA today as well, too. Old friends and new friends. But really the job at hand is for me to introduce kind of the real experts today who are still in the seat and are doing integration of intelligence every day from many different perspectives as we speak. I'm very privileged to count all of these individuals as my colleagues. I've had the opportunity to serve with them together and certainly look forward to the discussion we're going to have today. So I'll give you a few highlights. Many of you know the panelists, but a few highlights about their career. And what I'd like you to take a little bit of note on is the diversity of background. So you're going to hear and see panelists today who have actually served in headquarters units, who are former warfighters, intelligence officers, who served in agencies, who serve in industry, and also in the legislative branch as well, too. So I can't think of a better perspective from which to think about where we've come from 10 years, and also more importantly, what do we need to do in the next 10. So with that, immediately to my right, most people recognize Leslie Ireland, who is the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Intelligence and Analysis. A career intelligence officer with the CIA, she's had a number of distinguished jobs, some of them rather noteworthy, including the Presidential Daily Briefer in the current administration. Prior to that, also, Leslie was, as Joe mentioned, a mission manager, a RAND mission manager. And actually, she didn't get enough of that then. She's also dual-hatted as the National Intelligence Manager for Counter-Threat Finance. So she brings a wealth of experience across many of those different domains. Next, Dr. Troy Mink. And, some good advice I got from an old friend said, if you want to leave a good legacy, make sure that the person who replaces you is a lot better and a lot smarter than you are. And that's certainly the case in Dr. Troy Mink, who is the current Assistant Director of National Intelligence and Systems and Resource Analysis. Troy, a very distinguished career. Most recently, he was a Deputy Undersecretary for an Executive Agent for Space in the Pentagon, an enormous responsibility in terms of that job. Prior to that, he was the Director of Signals Intelligence Acquisition at the National Reconnaissance Office. And before that, a very distinguished career as an Air Force officer, including, I think, upwards of 24 or so combat support missions. So, Troy, welcome. After Troy, we have Ellen McCarthy, who is currently the Chief Operating Officer of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I have to also say that Ellen is, I think we would call her President Emeritus of INSA, who preceded Joe DeTrani in that role. Prior to that, Ellen spent time as a senior leader in the Undersecretary for Defense Intelligence, as leading their Human Capital and Management Office. And prior to that, actually, what many people don't know is Ellen spent a good bit of time with the Coast Guard Intelligence and Navy Intelligence, kind of shaping those two organizations as we transformed towards intelligence integration. To Ellen's left, Brian Smith. I'm going to start backwards with Brian as well, too. Brian started out as an Air Force intelligence officer not so long ago. And following that, had a very distinguished career in many different agencies. He held senior executive positions at the National Reconnaissance Office, OMB, and also ODNI, where he was the chief financial officer at ODNI. After that, he switched over to the legislative branch, served time as a staff member in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, before moving on to being the budget director of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, where he recently retired. So Brian, welcome. And last but certainly not least, Larry Pryor, who is Executive Vice President of CSC's North America Public Sector, an enormous job for those of you who know about this company and the breadth and scope that he has to lead. Larry is known for solutions, a solution provider, and an adamant practitioner of intelligence, which started, again, not so long ago, in the United States Marine Corps as an intelligence officer, where he distinguished himself there. So with that, a word or two about the order of march today. We're going to spend a little bit of time doing some programmed questions that we've designed to start to get at all the different angles with respect to this topic area. Before that, we're going to give some introductory, the panelists are going to give some introductory remarks on this topic, and then we're going to leave a little time for questions from the audience after the fact. We'll do this live from the floor, so if you have questions towards the end of the session, just raise your hand, and I think we have some ushers with roaming microphones that we'll arrange to link up with you. So with that, let me turn it over to Leslie Ireland.
Great. Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you all for coming today. It really struck me as I was preparing for today that it's been 10 years, and it hardly feels like it's been 10 years. But I think it's been a good 10 years. And I was privileged in 2004 during the formation of the legislation for intelligence reform and the creation of the DNI to be serving as John McLaughlin's executive assistant. And I see one of my fellow EAs over here, Larry Pfeiffer, and he survived as well. But I have to tell you, it was a fascinating year to be up there. We went through the 9/11 Commission. We went through the Rob Silverman Commission on Iraq WMD. We went through the SSCI report on the Iraq WMD estimate. We went through the creation of intelligence reform. And it was really a marvelous place to watch all of it unfold and to understand what some of the challenges were that the intelligence community faced and some of the decisions that were made about how to move forward. one of the things that drew my attention was obviously the Rob Silverman Commission. And I know Joe felt this as well. That was also known as the Iraq WMD Commission. And what I thought was a bit different about the approach they took to looking at the problem was they looked at areas where the intelligence community had been successful in its analysis on WMD issues, as well as areas where it had not been successful. So I felt like in the recommendations they brought forward, they balanced what needed to continue as well as what needed to change. And one of the areas that they had advised on was to have a mission manager. So that was the creation of what Joe and I and a couple of others ended up doing. And I actually happened to see Judge Silverman recently at an event, and I said, you know, there were some words you penned that stayed with me for a long time, which were, if you have one person who is responsible, you can hold one person who is accountable. And I thought about that a lot in my 3 years as the Iran mission manager. And what I would say is one of the challenges I found with mission management was that you had a lot of responsibility, but you didn't have a lot of authority. And so you were being asked to integrate when you had no real authority to integrate. And that, you had to draw a lot on your personal skills, your relationships in the intelligence community, as well as understanding what and defining the mission that you had. So what I wanted to do before I turned it over is to just identify for you 3 pivotal moments I felt I had in mission management and have stayed with me to this day. The first was I was pretty new in the job. I had one assistant and a secretary, an executive assistant. And so it was pretty lean and mean in the very beginning. And I was on the phone with another colleague from the IC, and I was trying to explain to them what I wanted to do. And they said, you know, we've seen this tried before. We're just waiting to see how long it takes to fail this time. Yeah. So anyone who knows me knows that I like a challenge. So I let the gauntlet lie there for probably about 5 minutes, and I felt discouraged, and then I picked it up and I thought, no, I'm going to make a difference. This is going to be different this time. And I think it has been different this time than it has been in the past. Second pivotal moment for me, got to the end of my first year, and I felt like I had built a community, I had built consensus, but I felt like I was spinning my wheels. I hired a contractor to do a 360 review of me, of mission management, of my staff. They interviewed other parts of the DNI, they interviewed the policy community, they interviewed the main stakeholders on the Iran issue inside the IC. And the reason I think that was critical, a couple reasons. One, I think mission management or national intelligence managers succeed when they identify what the IC needs. And then they come in and they help to fulfill that. Not replicating what's already being done, but identifying what needs to be done and coming in to fulfill that. And secondly, in that process, we identified a way to define intelligence gaps and to formulate a way to fill them and to address filling them in a repeatable and a consistent way that brought the community together and brought them together with the mission management staff. One of the responses on the 360 was that people were in it, they were in it because they were behind me. And there's part of that that's extremely flattering, but there's part of that that's very discouraging because that meant that if I walked away, the mission management would not continue. And we had to find a way to make that continue. And the third pivotal moment for me was defining priorities for the intelligence community. I'm sure you're familiar or you've heard of the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. I think it's a marvelous tool. It gives the policy community an opportunity to have input into where the intelligence community needs to focus. I felt we had too many #1 priorities on Iran. So I worked with the community. We winnowed it down. It wasn't an easy process, but I'm glad we got there. And I think that's part of the reason why we have the information that we have that enabled us to bring Iran to the table today to negotiate on their nuclear program. And I think that was not an elegant ending, but that sums that up.
Okay, Troy?
Thanks, Roger. So I've been at DNI for about 9 months now, and it's a, it's a fantastic team environment there, not only at the DNI, but across agencies. Matter of fact, I just got a note when I was walking up on stage from one of my coworkers, Kevin Miners, and it says, Troy, don't blow it. So I'm not sure that's representative, and I made it politically correct. It didn't actually say that. So I don't know that that's representative of the teamwork we have at the DNI, but representative Kevin. So as we all know, it's been about 10 years, actually 119 months since DNI is a SRA. Got to be precise in your analytics, right, Roger?
Yes.
119 months since the DNI was formed, and really a lot of jobs, but as you've heard today, primary mission was integration across the IC community, and this is probably even more important now than, or at least as important now as it's ever been, if not more so. To quote my boss, Director Clapper, from his testimony last week, make sure I get this right, but unpredictable instability is the new normal, and this pervasive uncertainty makes it even harder than normal to predict the future. Effectively, it's all he's saying is our job is not getting easier, it's getting harder. And the need for the intelligence integration and bringing the community together is more important now than almost ever. So I'm not necessarily a process person, but I am going to take just a few minutes to touch on when we say integration in the community. What do we see when we try to manage integration at the DNI? How do we bend that? What do we look at when we talk about integration? There's kind of three areas. There's mission integration, which you hear a lot about what do we do for mission integration. Leslie just touched on some of that. There's enterprise integration, which is not quite as exciting, but just as important. And then there's the foundational or the cross-cutting integration, which is becoming even more important, and I think is what's going to give us a lot of the tools to actually accelerate the level of integration in the community as we go forward. So just a couple quick highlights of what we mean when we say that. So mission integration, pretty straightforward. It's trying to make sure that the community works together on its intelligence and collection. Right? The NIMS, or the National Intelligence Managers, are a good example of that, trying to bring and look across a large problem and prioritize the resources and the collection and allocation, and not just budgetary, but people as well, analysts and collection resources as well as budget. Very effective and very influential position within the DNI right now. Very highly regarded in their recommendations on how we press forward. And of course, there's some of the big hard problems that everybody is aware of that we assign, like the National Counterterrorism Center, the National Counterproliferation Center, Cyber Center that's about to be stood up. Obviously, set up those type of centers to bring really a whole of government kind of approach and focus on a problem. Been very, very successful, or at least those have been very, very successful. And then last but not least, PDB. Trying to bring, in the PDB-like negotiations or discussions up to the White House, trying to bring a much broader and somewhat integrated IC community position up to the senior leader, right? It's become very effective, and there's been a lot of progress made in doing that within the IC community. So the second area is enterprise integration. Again, not quite as exciting as a lot of the stuff that goes on in mission integration, but again, just as important. That's trying to basically look at and structure in a more, not based on budget decisions, not based on personality, but budget decision based on analytics and the priorities established across the senior leadership and broader community. So there's been a lot of focus on developing and improving the processes and how those budget decisions are made and how the budgets are integrated and prioritized across the community. As was mentioned, acquisition and the other requirements processes, a lot of work has been done, a lot of success has been made in establishing both processes for acquisition, but also processes for requirements. Almost all systems we acquire now are touched by many, many other systems and support a broad set of users. So making sure, and that's one of the processes I run in SRA, is the requirements process, making sure that the entire IC community has a vote on that, as well as the DoD, right? Obviously, it's the DoD and other users of State Department, Treasury Department, all have a play or have a seat at the table when we talk about the requirements for our future system. That's obviously important. Great progress has been made in that. Matter of fact, that's something we're even looking at and trying to improve going forward. Obviously, as Kevin's responsible for is the acquisition process itself, making sure that we continue to execute and deliver our acquisitions as efficiently as possible, and the coordination that's required within and then outside of the IC. The last one, and again is extremely important, is the foundational or cross-cutting. Probably everybody's aware of one of the biggest examples, and that is eyesight. Right? You know, we can want to integrate, we can want to do data analytics, we can have goodness in mind on all decisions, but if we don't have the tools and the underlying foundation to make all the data discoverable and being able to allow the analytics to work, it's tough to get there, right? So there's been a huge push. It's one of the director and the principal deputy directors' biggest priorities is to make sure they deliver eyesight into the community that will allow a lot of that to go on. The other big thing, I know it was talked about, is trying to bring not only jointness from mission integration, but in the workforce as well. If you even look at a number of the leaders and the agencies across the community, a lot of those came out of joint billets, or you're seeing more and more the importance of joint billets and getting that joint broad perspective, not only for the workforce, but also in trying to bring jointness to how we do standards of data analytics standards, as well as training and everything else we do in the community to try to get, again, make sure everybody's speaking the same language when we say there's a low risk or a medium risk. Just getting everybody in agreement upon what that means is important so that we have a very clear message as we go forward. And so we've done a lot of work on trying to ensure that. So in summary, I think it's not that you know, we're hitting a plateau in integration. I think a number of the things we're doing, especially in the ability to share data and the jointness of the workforce, is actually going to allow us to increase the integration going forward, not just maintain what we're doing right now. So I'll be happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Troy. Over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Roger. It's an incredible honor to represent the intelligence community today. And I'll tell you that 10 years ago, I'm almost positive that's not how I would have introduced myself. I would have said, it's great to represent Navy, or it's great to represent Coast Guard. But today, I think it's fair to say 10 years later that I'm representing the intelligence community. I'll say that this, to me, is kind of like the 40-year reunion of Saturday Night Live. In fact, Charlie, I just remember not that long ago, you were on this stage dancing as one of the Blues Brothers. I'm not sure. Things do, but somehow they stay the same. But it's a chance to reflect on sort of where we've been when this all started. And I'll say that when 10 years ago, I was actually working for Steve Cambone and Tish Long at the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And that's when the press and all the internal IC chat rooms were saying, you know what, DOD is not supportive of a DNI. They're going to do everything they can to make sure that the DNI is not a success. I have to say that at that point, they actually asked me to stand up a team called DIRT. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it was the Defense Intelligence Reform Team, and it was our job to actually analyze the Intelligence Reform Act and provide recommendations back to the Undersecretary and to the defense components about how IRTPA was going to impact them. What are the policies, processes, and procedures that we need to change? And I'll tell you, the guidance that Dr. Cambone and Tish Long provided me and the rest of the USDI staff was, you will do everything that you can to make sure that the DNI is a success. And I'll tell you that regardless of what the press was reporting, that certainly was our mission at USDI 10 years ago. Then 6 years ago, I had an opportunity to get a different perspective of how we're doing with the stand of the DNI by coming to INSA. DNI was still new, still lots of chatter about its effectiveness and whether or not it was going to work. And I'll tell you that from the INSA perspective, there were a number of committees that we stood up in response to the DNI's request for support in terms of helping them do their job. There was a couple of SMART panels that were led by Joan Dempsey and Mary Sturdivant that really looked at some of the lessons learned from some of the budget-constrained days of the intelligence community early on, and how the community would not, should not follow some of those, make the same mistakes that were made then. Charlie Allen and Kathy Fearson stood up the Security Reform Council, which is still an incredible committee that really is looking at the policies and processes that need to change to make sure the public and private sector can work more closely, more effectively, more efficiently. From what I can tell, the DNI has picked up almost all of those recommendations and implemented them across the community. I would come back to government 2.5 years later at NGA, and I was amazed at how much things had changed from the time that I had left just a few years earlier in terms of integration. And again, when you hear from the outside, and I think Joan mentioned this, it's amazing what really is happening on the inside. And I'm happy to say that we're far more integrated than we were even 5 years ago. Heck, there are completely new capabilities that are fighting terrorism, fighting proliferation that weren't even there when I had left, and are just doing an amazing job. I have to say, Troy and Roger, SRA, I mean, again, what an amazing capability. The fact that you now have a group of people that are forecasting to the future and really looking at efficiencies and value and bringing that back to the community. I know my agency looks at that, and it's very much a part of our programming and planning process, what comes out of SRA. So I'll end my walk down memory lane with the observation that I don't think that anyone would say that the stand-up of a DNI has not been a good thing for the intelligence community. But before I turn over the microphone to you, Brian, I have to say that there are a couple of other things that I've observed. Troy, you mentioned joint duty. I mean, I have to say, what a struggle that was getting that program, that policy up and running. I mean, it was almost a physically painful struggle when Ron, if you're out there, Ron, I apologize. Because it's, 10 years later, it's an incredibly robust program. And I'll tell you that if you compare it to its equivalent in the Department of Defense on the military side of the house, that it took the military roughly 30 years to implement jointness within the branch. I think it was only a couple of years ago that you actually had all the services promoting folks to flag without having to use the waiver process. And I'll tell you that within NGA, nobody gets promoted to senior now 10 years later without having done a joint duty rotation. And in fact, even Robert Cardillo just recently got his joint duty award, and he was very proud of that. You could argue he's had joint duty for a long time. And my last point, and I promise, is Director Clapper's laser-like focus on intelligence integration, both horizontal and vertical. I'll tell you, my agency representing NGA, we're still pretty new. So integration was something that became a part of our DNA from the moment we stood up. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with the fact that Director Clapper made that happen. But I'm so proud to see that it's also a component, it's now a practice that the entire intelligence community is following through. And I have to make a call out to one of our own. For those of you who don't know Brian Lessenberry, he's a fellow now at CSIS, and he just published an article, and I would ask you to read it, because I think it's probably the best example of how the intelligence community is far more integrated now than it was 10 years ago. It's Intelligence Integration in the Syrian Chemical Weapons Threat. It was just published on February 18th. But it really provides a detailed account of how I see integration is working, and particularly in this case in dealing with the Syrian chemical weapons threat and sort of our role in countering that threat and providing support to policymakers. It's remarkable for a whole bunch of reasons. One, the fact that he's even publishing this article. It really goes through a detailed account of how we started it in 2011 and what happened and what the impact was. The fact that this is even being published is pretty darn amazing. It really gets to the DNI's call for more transparency. And also, so much of what was used was open source material in terms of driving operations. And so that was also remarkable in its own right. But really, it was perhaps the best test of the organizational construct the DNI stood up, in that most of the entities that were involved in this issue were not there 10 years ago, and their success, the National Counterproliferation Center, the mission managers. It really was a test. This was going to see, this really shows that this whole integration thing is actually kind of working. So I would say that while it may not be perfect, we've just made tremendous strides over 10 years. And I want to end with a quote. It's my favorite Mark Twain quote. When he said, when I was a boy 14 years old, my father was completely ignorant. I could barely stand to be around him. Now that I'm 21, I'm amazed at how much he's learned over the last 7 years. And I would say that it's absolutely the case here in the intelligence community. And 10 years after the stand of a DNI, boy, have we learned an awful lot. Or he's learned a lot. So thank you.
Ellen, thank you very much, Ellen. Terrific. Brian.
Well, I thought I would take some of the key endeavors and processes that the ODNI has been involved with and bend them into clear successes, areas that are pretty mixed, and then one area I'll suggest is kind of a left-behind area. But before I do that, I thought I would talk a little bit about congressional perception, because because with Congress, perception counts at least as much as reality, right? And so for any of you that know Roger, you know he's a consummate analyst, and he emphasized that he wanted to take a fact-based, evidence-based approach, be very clinical here. So I thought I would start with a story. And then from that story, I'll try to pull out maybe just one data point from that one data point, come to a wide sweeping universal conclusion about, it's kind of the way we do intelligence. So I remember very well when I worked at ODNI, accompanying Admiral McConnell to a budget hearing at the House Intelligence Committee. In the hearing, I was a backbencher, was doing CFO duties. And the hearing was going pretty well until it came to the turn for a very junior, young congressman from Michigan to ask a question. I think his name is Rogers. And he was very brash and very aggressive, and he just went on and on, lambasting Admiral McConnell about this bloated, inefficient, obstructionist agency that was getting in the way of all kinds of good operations by FBI and CIA. Well, Admiral McConnell was turning red, and I could see his white knuckles appearing, and I have visions of when baseball teams get in a fight and the bench is clear, and I saw I'm getting ready to rumble here. But I'm thinking if it comes to that, my money is going to be on the Article 1 guy over there who's making McConnell mad. So fast forward from that 4 years later, and I find myself in a meeting with that same congressman who is now the statesman-like chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and he's in there with his young staff director working up an agenda for his chairmanship in this Congress. And one of the key items is how do we empower the ODNI to better lead and integrate the community? Fast forward 4 years from that, and Mike Rogers is giving his farewell speech on the floor of the House of Representatives, and he actually gets choked up talking about operators in the field, the kind of men and women who are risking their lives daily, doing really hard and important things. And shortly after that, or maybe shortly before that, he mentions Jim Clapper and gives thanks to him. Didn't really choke up when he mentioned ODNI. So what do I draw from that? I think the ODNI has been able to capture the minds of Congress, if not their hearts. And that's probably as it should be. So the successes, and the previous panel and the DNIs talked about two of the marquee mission successes. One, support to operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where not only did we integrate key pieces of information, HUMINT, SIGINT, full motion video, but we also integrated that intelligence with the operators. And another marquee mission success has been in the CT fight more broadly. And there not only was NCTC playing a pivotal role, and I think everyone agrees that that's been a real success, but also if you look at all those plots that have been identified and thwarted, FISA authorities were critical to that, and DNI McConnell was critical. He talked about how hard it is to pass legislation. He was really the driving force in that FISA modernization. So this institution has had a huge, I think, mark on the CT fight. But then also something you don't hear so much about, counter-proliferation. And I didn't know, Ellen, you were going to bring up the Syrian CW support, but that is really the textbook case, in my view, of intelligence integration, where not only were the various agencies pulled together under very strong, capable mission management, but it was integrated with the policy community. Other clear successes or future successes, eyesight. I think about everyone mentioned this. And a game changer potentially in mission, but also in enterprise in the sense that when DNI Clapper had to face sequestration and find these really huge savings, especially in the out years, it was able to reduce the IT enterprise funding, which was very substantial, and reduce that by 25%. So that if eyesight doesn't save those monies anticipated, then mission will suffer. That's one of the reasons I think eyesight will be successful in finding those savings. And in Congress, there's still a lot of lingering questions about about security risks, but I think those are being capably addressed by the DNI. Another clear success, remediating the tradecraft errors that led to grievous mistakes in Iraq, WMD. Kind of the flip side of that is that there is such an abundance of caution in the analytical community, especially when they come up to talk to the Hill. And sometimes you want to just say, come on, what do you really think? You get an awful lot of, well, the scenario is it's going to get worse, it's going to get better, it's going to stay the same. I think we can get beyond that. Areas that are where there has been progress, but probably more needs to be done than is already achieved. General Cartwright talked about the collection architecture. When Admiral McConnell came into office, he was staring into a very serious collection gap with imagery. He was able to make some moves that fix that. Also was looking at chronic cost overruns and schedule slips and put in train some processes that have fixed that. And that's a good news story that really doesn't get enough play, and a lot of that's with the NRO and with industry. But Congress still has this wanted sign out there, and it's posted all over the place, and it says wanted. Collection architecture, integrated, affordable, cost-effective, takes advantage of commercial technologies. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's got to be in the top of the DNI's job jar, and certainly the PD DNI is painfully aware and is working very hard on that. Security clearance management. IRTPA lays out standards or goals for getting how long it will take to get people cleared. ODNI worked hard with OPM and OMB and met those standards, exceeded them. But as we saw with the Snowden incident, not all is well with security clearance management. So now I think the DNI faces a much tougher challenge than formally meeting those IRTPA targets. Challenge is to implement an effective continuous evaluation system that also respects people's rights. And related to, as a segue to the next point I wanted to make about areas that need improvement, and the area I'm thinking of is measuring performance and evaluating performance. And the poster child for us not being able to do that very well has to do with security clearance. CI matters. I remember about 2 months before Mr. Snowden hit the papers, Congress was presented with a stoplight chart that laid out the status of implementing the insider threat reform that was laid out in the wake of the Bradley Manning leaks. And if you looked at NSA, there were like 5 parameters that were measured. And if you looked at NSA, each cell was as green as the hills of Ireland. But that's just kind of an egregious example. It's been tough for the IC to measure performance, and I think Roger and Troy have made some real headway there. And I think of a couple areas where where the DNI has called on the SRA organization, and they've responded extremely well. But these are on a big issue by issue basis. What I think is really needed is some systematic way of measuring performance. And kind of the irony to me is that right now we either have the data available or accessible, or we have the means to access really important data, combine it with advanced analytical methods commercially available, so that we can really understand the linkage between the money we're spending on things, on programs, and how they perform. But with all that potential, I question whether there is really a strong demand signal from the Hill and within the administration. But as budgets get tighter and tighter, we'll need that. Finally, the left behind area, I think it's Homeland, I guess we call it Homeland Intelligence rather than domestic intelligence. That's not to say there haven't been huge successes and improvements. I mean, FBI has transformed itself from a law enforcement agency to a hybrid CT law enforcement agency, and DHS has made some real strides. But what I think is lacking is that unity of effort you see in the CT fight, in the counterproliferation area, in some of these country campaigns. So I think that is really an area that needs a lot of improvement. So I've probably talked past my time.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. Larry.
So I want to start with a suggested model for the DNI. And people have struggled from quarterback to coach to CEO. And I'd suggest a business model called the conglomerate. And the market is littered with failed examples of conglomerates. But one that's incredibly successful, celebrating their 50th anniversary, is Berkshire Hathaway. And it starts with leadership, where they have Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Not a coincidence that we have a Charlie Allen in the Intel community. If you think of what their core competencies are, there are two. So one is understanding the intrinsic value of the component pieces of the conglomerate and letting them do their job. And whether it's See's Candy or Nutty Buddies or Geico Insurance or Rail, they understand that component part has inherent capabilities, core competencies that are unique to their cabinet or to their role in supporting them in decision and operations. And I think the DNI has done a great job of recognizing that light touch, federated model of a conglomerate. The second incredible task of Berkshire Hathaway is around efficient capital. They move capital incredibly well across their conglomerate, and it's a great advantage to them in the marketplace. And I'd suggest that General Clapper and his predecessors have identified that human capital is the intellectual property of the intel community, and with the emphasis on protecting our blue badgers as we've ramped for war and as we've come back down, as we've cut budgets, as well as to develop leadership, they recognize that that's the capital that needs to be efficiently managed within the community. And then the second one, and Haas Cartwright mentioned it, is data. Our ability to move data across this complex enterprise to gain competitive advantage over our adversaries is absolutely the role, the responsibility of this complex enterprise called the IC. There's a role to be played by industry. And it starts with the electromagnetic spectrum, and wherever you are on it, we help design the ability to collect against it. We are a services industry, so as we support the president and that cabinet secretary, we have to deliver a service-based product. The better we do that with good metrics, with good IT infrastructure, the better we serve that customer. Industry really felt the challenges of the ramp to wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the global war on terror. And we have been consolidating and cutting costs as we've brought those budgets down. That is the role of industry. We didn't have a draft for this war. We haven't put our professional blue badge workforce through the gyrations that might have caused if we'd done it purely on the government side. And I think that is an essential role of industry in this model. As we look to create generalists who are broadly trained across the community, industry has a role to play to be there when they move, to provide depth of understanding. And for many of you in industry who served in the community, that's an opportunity to devote a couple extra decades to the cause. In my current job, I get to spend a lot of time across government. And whether it's state and local or healthcare, thank God I get to spend time in the intelligence community. We don't know how well we have it until you go work a local project in some county on the other side of the United States. This is absolutely a competitive advantage that we have in the United States, and hopefully one we continue to foster. I'll close with one concern, and it's as we try to gain the efficiencies and the promise of eyesight, it's less a technical challenge than an organizational leadership challenge that someday we're going to have to rationalize the applications across that entire eyesight enterprise, and it's non-trivial to find the leadership and the moment to do that. I'd also argue that the pace of change, and I was fun at one of the breaks, I got to talk to one of my software as a service partners, and they're all out there, right? So when you talk about SMAC, social and mobile and analytics and cloud, we're in the thick of it. The rate of change in the commercial sector is unbelievable. Our relationship between industry and government is going to allow us to manage that, I think, to good effect. But the one last challenge, I think, is the reconciliation between civil liberties and privacy and a real concern for national security in the domestic market. And as we think about FISA and what has to happen in June, we as a community need to do a better job with our Silicon Valley partners, as well as that balance between civil liberties and national security. Thank you.
Great. Larry, thank you very much. I'm going to call a little bit of an audible here. My distinguished panel has overachieved a little bit in terms of the introductory remarks, but I think you'll agree with me that they were completely insightful, and I really enjoyed every syllable.
Of course they did.
So let me do this. Let's take 2 questions. I'll do the first. And for those of you who want to try to run to the microphone to get your chance, if you're so inclined, you can do so now, and we'll take the first person there. If you don't, I'll ask the second one, and we'll call it a day. Okay, the first question actually is kind of in honor of our colleague that Troy mentioned, Kevin Miners, who's the Assistant Director of National Intelligence for Acquisition Technology and Facilities. And the question is about acquisition and technology initiatives in a broad sense. And that is, if you think back 10 years ago, most of the acquisitions and technology initiatives were born, they were developed, everything within agencies and within the means thereof. How has the implementation of the major system acquisition process, as well as the collaborative efforts that go on in this schema, kind of helped both from a mission standpoint as well as a technology development standpoint, and then looking towards the future, what can we change to improve that over time? So I'll offer it up to anyone who'd like to respond. If you don't respond, I'll call on somebody. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to start.
Larry? Yeah, sure.
So I think when you think of intelligence reform and terrorist prevention, we made the right choice. We got terrorist prevention right there up on the top of our list. And I think across agencies, you had to collaborate to find and fix targets that the nation took care of. So we had a forcing function right at a moment in time that this act was created for. And it allowed the DNI to walk across agency budgets and walk across bureaucratic barriers and to begin to exercise and test the limits of what the program manager of the National Intelligence Program can do. I think we did a remarkable job on major programs and specific actions. I think as we look to the future, I would invite them to focus on their mission managers to test the life cycle from requirements to program reviews and find out what the boundary conditions are for the legal limitations as the program manager for the NIP, and continue to have those relationships across those boundaries and do good for the nation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Larry. Others like to contribute to that?
Yeah, I might be able to add something to it.
Great, thank you.
I'll tell you that, we hear from Kevin Miners and Troy all the time about how we internally manage our resources to support these sort of community goals. And what I found over my last 2 years at NGA, that it's now we know. I mean, thanks to the DNI and our overseers at USD, our word is we need to go. And I say thanks, I mean it. I'm not being sarcastic in that regard. But our challenge really gets to the people piece in terms of how do we get there, sort of the skill sets of our seniors. At NGA, we've implemented portfolio management as a construct, and we have our lead operators who are also now driving programs, budgeting. They're involved in the PPBE process, and I am 100% confident that in 1988 they never had any idea that this is what we were going to expect of them, and yet now they are in the top tier of our leadership in the government. And so these joint duty programs, it's helping, but it's is it helping us fast enough in terms of the advice we need to get our people to understand how we actually get to where it is that the DNI has actually said this is where we need to go.
Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, you have a unique perspective being at both USDI
Right.
and an agency now,
Right.
so that's terrific. Others like to add? Or-
So,
yeah, Troy?
one more pile on Roger. So one of the, historically, what we've done, and actually you and I have had this conversation before, we actually define requirements for programs at a very kind of minute system level. The challenge is we become more and more integrated. Most of the end effect or the mission support requires a contribution of many different assets tied together. I think, Brian, you kind of poked at one of them, is where is the larger GeoInt architecture that gives you an affordable end capability versus a specific satellite. So we're actually looking at expanding the way we do our capabilities definition to kind of raise it up to a level to try to define what we want at an enterprise level, not just at a specific satellite or a specific ground processor or a specific level, to try to bring that cross-community look. The hope is not only to provide more mission, but if you do that, we should be able to provide that mission more cost-effective as well.
Great. Leslie?
Just a thought from the mission manager perspective. When we started in the ODNI, we had 4, and it grew to 6, and now we have a greater number. I think the advantage of having a mission manager on a particular topic area is you can work to identify what are the critical needs, and you can be part of the broader discussion about where community resources need to go. When I was around mission manager, I was pushing for a particular program, and I had one agency say to me, well, if we do that for you, why shouldn't we do it for everybody? And I say, you do it for me because I got to you first. And that was the right answer at the time. I know it's not the right answer now. But the point being, I think the advantage of having people who really can identify what the critical needs are, what the critical issues that we're facing, we can have a more informed conversation about where we need to push acquisition in the future.
Yeah. I absolutely agree, and I certainly saw from my time there the national intelligence managers from day one versus when I left, a huge kind of maturity in terms of understanding of the processes, how to use them, how to influence them, and actually get that mission understanding into the requirements. It was terrific. Okay, so I'm told we have one question. One question? Great.
Thank you for your comments. James Katavolis with Citigroup. As we look forward to the threats that we're likely to encounter and already are starting to encounter, I think it strikes me that there's a really strong need for us to begin to figure out how we're going to share information between the intelligence community and the private sector. And I know that there's been an awful lot of work done over the last 10 years in terms of integrating within the IC. I wonder if any of you would have comments looking forward about what lessons we've learned and can bring to bear in terms of kind of integrating critical infrastructure owners and operators more with the intelligence community. Any comments on that?
Okay, great. Open to the panel. You've stumped us all.
No, I should probably jump in on that one.
Yeah.
So a big welcome to Citigroup. I'm going to put in part my hat on as the Assistant Secretary at the Treasury Department. But I think you knew that when you asked the question. Yeah, there it is.
Good for you.
Couple thoughts I would say is I see info sharing with the sector in two ways. I see it as sharing between the sector. So I think that within the financial sector, I think you all need to do a better job and have a greater willingness to share information, and in particular, I'm thinking about the cyber threat, because that's what we deal with on a most regular basis. And then I think there's the issue of sharing between the sector and the government. And it's not just true for the financial sector. When you get into critical infrastructure protection, there are 12 specific sectors, and there's going to be a government agency that is your sector-specific partner. So obviously for you, it's the Treasury Department. As I've looked into that, and I've tried to push for that, the areas that I find are stumbling blocks are, one, we need to be concerned about potentially giving one institution a substantial advantage over another. So I think we need to look at how do we share that information and get over that stumbling block. Second, I've come to the conclusion is you can't clear your way out of the problem. It's not an issue of giving everybody security clearances. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what the DNI is trying to do right now. So I think we in the government need to look at ways that we can get the information downgraded, declassified, get it out to you. But that also means dialogue in terms of you tell us exactly what you need, so we can be more specific about what we provide to you. And then finally, the point I made earlier is the issue of sharing more information between yourselves, because one of the things that I've come to appreciate being in the intelligence community and now looking at the financial sector, there's a texture that you understand to day-to-day operations, day-to-day financial operations that we don't get. Just the way there's a day-to-day understanding about intelligence issues that you won't understand, but you're going to understand anomalies, you're going to understand activity that shouldn't be there, and sharing it between yourselves, I think, is going to be very important.
Yeah, I think there's a great role to be played by industry as well. So if you think of the in-depth knowledge of a Northrop Grumman or a Lockheed or a Mantech or a CACI, as they support their government customers here, they're all out doing risk management, NOx and SOX, and supporting the commercial, industries. So you'll see, the movement of talent inside and outside of government support to commercial support, and can benefit from that.
Okay, so we've exhausted our time here today. We really appreciate the panel members. Thank you for your time today. We know the enormity of your schedule. I'm honored again to share the stage with you, so thank you for that. It was very good to see everyone again. Thank you to INSA and also the audience. I hear you've got a great keynote for lunch, and so we're going to make way and get on with the rest of the agenda. So thank you very much.